seeing clearly the grotesque. But my question, and I'm posing it to both of you, either of you, Mr. Jones, Ms. Cooper, what additional steps is NATO considering in order to end Russia's war in Ukraine as soon as possible, as well as to deter any future aggression? Obviously, if we end it sooner than later, I think that will be a powerful deterrence. What else is NATO doing? What else is the administration summoning up to end this sooner?
I'll talk briefly about what NATO is doing. NATO is also committed to supporting Ukraine in this conflict, but NATO's role has been primarily to provide non-lethal support to complement the lethal assistance that is being given bilaterally through the Ukraine Defense Coordination Group that Laura described. The alliance has been going through a historic transformation of its own deterrence and defense in order to ensure that there is no aggression against NATO territory. NATO has expanded its forward deployed forces, doubling the number of battle groups that it has on its eastern front, almost doubling the number of troops it has forward deployed. And NATO is also in the process of completing and is on track to complete at the Vilnius summit a complete rework of its defense plans to take in a comprehensive plan for the defense of Europe, which will both strengthen its deterrent and I think send a clear message about our ironclad commitment to defend every inch of NATO territory.
And if I may add, so from a perspective of your point, to support the Ukrainians in winning this war, I would say that right now we are very focused on ensuring that the Ukrainians have what they need in the counteroffensive. We have helped support them to build 9 new brigades. This is an amazing achievement and a tribute to the work of U.S. European Command and our allies and partners. So these 9 brigades have been outfitted with the best kit possible, with tanks, with infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, and with plenty of ammunition. And we are watching to see what else they need. As things break, we're getting them spare parts or replacement capabilities. So that's a very tangible, very practical thing that we're doing. But I want to also emphasize that this is not just about today. It's also about showing Russia that they cannot wait us out, and showing Russia that we are there to support Ukraine for the long haul. And that's something that you see reflected in the NATO discussions, but you also see it reflected in our bilateral discussions, both in private and in public. And I think that will be increasingly important. Thank you.
I thank you. And with the little time I have left, I thank you both for those answers. And the 9 brigades is impressive and important. And I know we must be continuing to do more and more of that. I'm thinking also, what additional security assurances for Ukraine will the Biden administration support at the upcoming summit? I'm thinking along the lines of the kind of Israel-style support, the security agreement, the memorandum of understanding that we have, multi-year commitments to Ukraine. I know you spoke to a little bit in your testimony, but if you wouldn't mind detailing that.
Thank you. And I'll just touch on, again, the bilateral dimension of this. And of course, there's the multilateral NATO dimension of this. So, we are engaged in discussions on how we can support Ukraine and give that sense of confidence that they will have what they need, not just today, but in the long term, so that as there is an end to this war, we will also be deterring future Russian aggression. And so these are conversations that are occurring in diplomatic and in military-to-military channels, and will continue to unfold.
Terrific. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. I now recognize Mr. Self from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my colleagues are going to cover Ukraine and the major issues quite well. In the lead up to Vilnius, I want to go to former Yugoslavia. You have a potential flashpoint, Deputy Assistant Secretary Jones, in the Serbia-Kosovo area. And I think people need to realize it. From my time in NATO and the European Command in the 90s, during the multiple civil wars, there are some issues that have not been solved between Serbia and Kosovo. As you know, the Serbs basically boycotted the recent election. The Kosovars took their rightfully elected positions, and now we have a potential flashpoint between Serbia and Kosovo. Can you give me your opinion before I ask my questions?
So I agree with your assessment on the potential flashpoint, and certainly NATO has a long history in the Balkans. Regarding Serbia and Kosovo, we're engaged in intense diplomacy dialogue, and we are supporting, as a way ahead, the EU's three-point plan, which is calling for de-escalation by both parties, new elections, this time with Kosovo-Serb participation, and also the normalization agreement implementation.
And you mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina in your written testimony. You did not mention this at all. And let's go to this election, because the Serbs boycotted it, and I thought you would mention you wanted new elections.
Through a proper election. However, they have not attempt to move into their municipal office.
But that's my question. Duly elected mayors are trying to do their duty to move into the office buildings, and we are supporting a redo as opposed to supporting these duly elected mayors. Why is that?
So these mayors, due to the boycott, they were elected with an extremely low percentage.
That happens every day in America. We have local elections where we have 10% turnout, and we don't fight it because we have a low turnout.
Yeah, but it's led to large portions of the electorate feeling disenfranchised if they are at their own choice.
Correct.
They are willing to come back and vote, as we are urging them to. I think that would result in a more stable process and a more representative government that would help end the current conflict that we're seeing there.
The real problem I see is the State Department is trying to pull Serbia away from the Russian orbit. You're intervening in elections that were properly held. You're interfering with people who were properly elected to try to insert yourself into a millennia-old issue here, and you are upsetting a duly executed election. You're not going to pull Serbia out of the Russian orbit. You might as well let Kosovo. We have recognized Kosovo. I know a lot of people have not, a lot of countries have not, but we have recognized Kosovo. You need to, I encourage you to rethink your position on this Serbian-Kosovar conflict here, because you need to be standing for the rule of law, which is duly elected officials trying to do their duty. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I've got a number of questions. First of all, let me begin with weapons to Ukraine. Clearly, we've done an incredible job, but obviously more work needs to be done for for ourselves and NATO to ensure that this counteroffensive is successful. The Ukraine has repeatedly requested cluster munitions, including dual-purpose improvised conventional munitions, and I'm not going to go through the acronym, but a host of other factors. Where are we on that? And I know we've struggled with the F-16s, and I know that's in progress, but right now they need these dual purposes, improved conventional munitions. Where are we?
Congressman, I refer to it as DPICMs for short.
That's fine.
On this issue, the military advice that we have received is that they would make a difference on the battlefield, that they would be effective against dug-in Russian positions. There are two factors that weigh heavily in the decision-making. The one is that, Congress has actually legislated a restriction on transfer of these munitions with a dud rate above 1%. So the congressional
Well, if it's our responsibility, we can deal with that. I'm not looking for excuses. We know they would be effective. So you're saying that we have to act?
Well, right now, there is legislation that restricts the transfer.
I heard you.
And then the second piece is the question of allies' reaction and
Well,
alliance.
then what you're saying is we're in a standstill until we make changes on the legislation, until we get support with our allies. Is that the answer? I've got other questions I want to ask. That's the answer?
I think it would be important for us to understand where members of Congress are on this issue.
Well, okay, let's move on. We'll take that and follow up. Germany's national security strategy. Last view at major threats facing Germany. The strategy calls broad goals to increase defense spending and deploy more capable, robust armed forces. What's your impression of the strategy? Have you looked at it? The goals? Is this aspirational or is it realistic?
So I think, in general, the strategy, we're reviewing the strategy, but we've been quite like-minded with Germany and a lot of the issues.
Okay,
that
but
it
the bottom
addresses.
line, is this aspirational or is this, can they achieve this? Is it realistic?
Are you talking about the defense spending?
Yeah, that's been a
specifically?
problem as well with Germany.
So far, they laid out a very impressive plan for increased defense spending, but we have yet to see it materialize.
So the proof is in the pudding. Okay, let me move to Armenia. Clearly, Azerbaijan has no intention of following through with the Minsk Accord, and Russia is not going to, they can't abide by any international rules that they previously committed to. The Lachin corridor continues to be closed to Nagorno-Karabakh, and the blockade exists. Simply put, Armenians are suffering. What's our effort to try to deal with this?
I can share my perspective as a Defense Department official who handles this part of the world. First of all, I have to credit Secretary Blinken and National Security Council leadership for the work that they are doing to try to actually achieve a successful peace process.
No, I know that's fine, but what are we doing to deal with the blockade on the Lachin corridor?
And so that, those peace negotiations are the path to stability and peace.
So where are we on this? I mean, Azerbaijan has no intention of following through. They haven't followed through on their previous agreements. And we sure as hell can't expect Russia.
So in terms of the peace negotiations, we actually are cautiously optimistic that we're making some
I'd like
progress.
to talk offline on what your optimism is and why.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've got 49 seconds now, please. I want to talk about burden sharing and defense spending. The Vilnius summit that's coming up includes making 2% of the GDP target a spending floor rather than a ceiling. However, we know some of the European countries have struggled to reach the 2% historically, and this goes back 3 administrations, back to the Bush administration. The pace of their military procurements has led to delays in spending appropriated funds. And finally, NATO countries close to reaching 2% increased spending, I think, is coming as a one-off thing. In other words, one-off supplemental funding packages instead of an increased annual funding. Where do you think we can make some progress in the summit coming up?
So we are seeing progress, slow progress, too slow progress, and increased allied defense spending. I think for the summit specifically, it's with a stronger defense investment pledge. And we agree with that we should set 2% as the floor for allied defense spending. And in addition to that, we're working to ensure there's also language in there that aims to go higher than 2%, because we'll need more than 2% in our estimation for allies to be able to have the money to provide
No, absolutely,
capabilities that we
absolutely.
need.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but I do want to follow up. Chairman Moran and I were in Vilnius, in Stockholm this weekend, meeting with Swedish officials about their ability to become a part of NATO. And I want to find out what we're prepared to do in the upcoming summit to assist Sweden in its ability to become a part of NATO. It's critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. I now recognize Mr. Moran of Texas for 5 minutes.
That was a perfect segue to the first question I have. So let's go with Mr. Costa's question, because we did have a good time discussing the NATO accession for Sweden this weekend, both bilaterally with Swedish government officials and then multilaterally with EU Parliament members. And there's strong support all the way around from everybody to make sure that Sweden gets into to NATO and to do it in a very timely fashion. So what pressures are we applying from the U.S. government to ensure that the blockade or the objection by Turkey goes away and that Hungary follows suit and that we get Sweden into NATO as quickly as possible?
This is a top priority of the United States that Sweden become a NATO ally by Vilnius, and we are actively and persistently raising this with Turkey and with Hungary at all levels. Most recently, yesterday, Secretary Blinken in his meeting with Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan focused intensely on this. So our belief is that allies have taken, or Sweden has taken, Turkey's counterterrorism concerns into account and has implemented largely the memorandum of agreement that they reached with Turkey and Finland, and Sweden is ready to become a member of the alliance now.
Now, let me just take issue just briefly with the word you said, largely. You said that Sweden largely complied with the MOU, but I haven't found an instance where they did not comply. And in fact, it looks like to me that Sweden has complied beyond what the MOU required, has gone above and beyond, and has done everything that Turkey has required in order to remove those objections. Is there something specifically that the U.S. government would say that Sweden still needs to do?
No, I would agree. They have implemented the MOA.
Yeah, and they've done a great job getting to that 2% mark for defense. And they've done a great job getting to that 2% mark for defense spending of GDP, and that's getting there quickly. And so it looks like to me that we need to continue to put pressure on Turkey. Does Turkey understand that if this does not happen, if the objection does not go away and Sweden does not accede into NATO, that their request for military equipment could be at peril?
So yes, I mean, I think Turkey realizes, and because they're hearing it not only from us but from all allies, the strong support for Sweden to join by Vilnius. They also realize that ratifying Sweden by the Vilnius summit would help in many of these of the weapons transfers that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's critical that we continue, and we are as a bipartisan group, at least this last weekend, and I think consistently have projected that message from Congress to Turkish officials that we need them to cooperate in this manner, because Sweden's decision to come out of neutrality after 200 years, frankly, of being neutral. I mean, most folks don't know that Sweden, it's a big step for them. They've been a neutral country for 200 years, and they decided to come out and apply for NATO membership. They, in the first time in about 80 years, provided weapons systems to another country. They hadn't done that since the World War II time period. Those are big steps for them to take to say we are on the side of what's good in this world, and we need to meet that with appropriate force, in my opinion, and appropriate leverage to make sure that their steps are successful in getting into NATO. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. It's a historic shift that we've seen in both Finland and Sweden. These were centuries-old policies of neutrality, and so a point that we frequently make to Turkey is not only is it about Turkey demands on counterterrorism, but this is also an issue that affects alliance security, and it affects the security of other allies as well.
That's right. All right, so when we're talking about the NATO alliance, just with my last minute, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. And I know they want to get into NATO one of these days. There's some hesitation to do that before peace, after the Ukraine-Russia war, once that ends. And there's talk about maybe a pathway, but at the Vilnius summit, do you think it might be better just to set some benchmarks out there to say, hey, we need to get to these benchmarks before we even establish a pathway potentially for Ukraine becoming part of NATO? Do you think that's an appropriate and wise step?
Well, I think what we're trying to accomplish, and I think we will accomplish, is a really strong message of support for Ukraine, including not only going beyond what we said before about our commitment that Ukraine will become an ally, but also to provide increased support from NATO for its current conflict with Russia, and also a really package that we're building, really an unprecedented package, to help Ukraine implement the reforms it needs so that it's ready to join NATO once the conflict ends.
All right, thanks. I'd continue to urge you to do whatever we can for Sweden to get them into NATO. As you know, they're going to be a great long-term economic, diplomatic, and military partner, and them being part of NATO is a critical step in that process. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. I recognize Mr. Wilson of South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keene, and thank you and Representative Bill Keating. Both secretaries, you're going to see something really remarkable with the leadership of Chairman Keene, where Republicans and Democrats want you to succeed. And that's why so many of the questions that you see and are meant to be very positive, and they are. And but we want you to succeed, because war criminal Putin has inadvertently unified NATO, as we see with Congressman Rand pointing out about Sweden joining NATO, giving up its neutralism after 200 years. We see the incredible people of Finland who were successful in the Winter War of 1939 to resist invasion. We see the European Union coming together, providing over $75 billion of aid to the people of Ukraine. And then, again, possibly even more remarkable, something that Putin didn't mean to do, and that is get Republicans and Democrats to work together. And that's why we want you to succeed. And you could see by the questions from Congressman Costa, Congressman Moran with the Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, we want you to do well. And then I was really very pleased with the passion by Congresswoman and Ambassador Ann Wagner. We want the right weaponry delivered as quickly as possible. And in line with that, Ms. Cooper, you mentioned the legislative restrictions on the provision of the DPICMs, and that's the dual purpose improved conventional munitions. However, there is a waiver available for the President that was not mentioned, that he can exercise this waiver at any time, and given the assessment that these would be effective for the people of Ukraine, for the counteroffensive, why isn't this issue addressed with a waiver immediately?
Congressman, so on the issue of DPICMs, there is the question of congressional support, and certainly there is a provision for a waiver. That's absolutely accurate. But certainly the administration would want to understand, congressional sentiment on this issue before taking such a step. And then the other piece of it that I had mentioned earlier is the alliance unity piece. Since we do have a considerable number of NATO members that have signed up to the convention prohibiting cluster munitions, there are some concerns about whether this would lead to divisions.
Well, hey, I want you to be aware, when you have good people, amazingly enough, like former NATO president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Jerry Connolly here, he can verify to you that there's a majority in Congress that wants DPICMs to be provided, that even though there may be members of NATO that will not be supportive, it needs to be done. And for the benefit of success, we want President Biden to be successful in this initiative, and to be successful means that the people of Ukraine have the most advanced weaponry with the longest range, the most effectiveness that, to face a war criminal who the mining of Ukraine, I mean, just over and over again, the war crimes that are being committed. With that in mind, also, Secretary Jones, following the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine's NATO aspirations were welcomed, and a path to membership was confirmed. The people of Ukraine have certainly indicated, and by giving blood to every effort, that they want a clear path to NATO membership. And Americans also want victory, and that's why, as myself, as chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, we introduced House Resolution 332, which defines victory and a path forward for NATO membership. And also, it's bipartisan with 12 other members to provide for President Biden to call for a concrete pathway for Ukraine at the Vilnius summit to provide for NATO membership. With that, why is the administration hesitant on moving ahead with Ukraine?
So I think, as I've said, one of our top goals for this summit is a strong message of support for Ukraine, and to not only reaffirm what the allies said at Bucharest, that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, but also to back that up with an increased package of non-lethal support, larger than before, and also to unveil this package of support to signal the alliance's long-term commitment, that the alliance is there to support Ukraine over the long term, and to focus this assistance on helping Ukraine meet its reform agenda so that it can meet NATO's membership standards. Because Ukraine and allies agree that Ukraine can't join NATO while there's an active conflict, but we can, through this assistance, help Ukraine to advance its reform so it can be ready to join NATO when conditions permit.
Well, there'll be bipartisan support for this, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I now recognize Mr. Connolly from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to participate. Welcome to our two witnesses. And let me just say, I think hopefully you have heard on a bipartisan basis, and I hope it helps you diplomatically and in counterpart-to-counterpart discussions. I do think the sentiment here in Congress is no F-16s or major weapon sales to Turkey until they've decided to release Sweden and allow Sweden's accession immediately into NATO. Turkey doesn't get to do that without, block it without consequences. I also believe that in Congress there's probably broad support for going ahead with F-16s for Ukraine and going ahead at Vilnius and giving the green light to an invitation, a direct invitation to Ukraine for membership. Ms. Cooper, I would say to you, I appreciate, and I think a lot of my colleagues appreciate, your concern and deference to Congress about certain things like cluster bombs. That's not a non-controversial item, and it's not necessarily in the approved list on a bipartisan basis going to Ukraine. And we need to have that debate and that discussion, and you're absolutely right to express the caution you did from my point of view. Mr. Assistant Secretary, I'm going to ask you two questions. One is maybe easier than the other. The other one's not going to be particularly an invitation to a diplomatic answer, but it's going to be direct. So the first one is, where are we? As you know, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly has virtually unanimously hundreds of parliamentarians representing 31 parliaments have recommended the creation of a Center for Democratic Resilience at NATO itself, so that we are, in fact, operationalizing the avowed commitment we have to democratic shared values, creating an architecture to propound, advocate for, and be a resource about democracy and democratic institutions. Real briefly, where are we in that? Because last time I checked, we had 29 out of 30 ambassadors to the North Atlantic Council supporting the idea.
So we support the idea. We think it would be an important forum for NATO to protect its shared values that are the basis for the alliance, and we have advocated for this at NATO. We made a strong push for this before the Madrid summit, but unfortunately there was not NATO consensus or unanimity as is required for all NATO decisions. And so we elected, rather than take on amendments to that proposal that would have, in our mind, gutted it, we elected to play a long game and continue to push for this. And we are regularly raising this at NATO, including at recent North Atlantic Council meetings. And we don't think this will be delivered by by Vilnius. But we think we can keep advocating for this, and in the long term.
Well, taking a page out of Ms. Cooper's book, I think it is important to take cognizance of the fact that the House of Representatives passed a resolution endorsing this on a big bipartisan vote. So, you know, it's not like some stray idea that might be good to pursue. Not that you're saying that, but it has standing in Congress. We actually acted on it.
And I think that the support from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly has actually been critical in
Good.
this effort, and it makes a big impact with those
Now you're being
allies who have not
You're
yet
being
agreed.
diplomatic, Mr. Jones. You said we operate unanimously, and I pointed out 29 of 30 ambassadors support it. So who, pray tell, is not supporting it and blocking it?
Well,
You can say it.
all right, I prefer not to talk about what happens.
I know, but
behind
we prefer to
negotiating.
talk about it.
All right, well, I think you know. So
Did I hear you say hungry?
you
Yes, that's what I thought.
you said that. But
So, real quickly, but I'll make a statement so I don't put you in it. I think the time has come to reassess the relationship with Hungary across the board. The EU is doing it and has suspended aid. It is absolutely going down a road that compromises democratic institutions. It has publicly criticized the United States for undermining its own legitimacy as a government, rather than
So because it's a U.S. Aircraft per standard requesting the
Russia. It has strengthened its relationships with Russia in the middle of a war. It has threatened
ability to do that third-party transfer, it's an administrative
to block further sanctions, and it's blocking
requirement in terms of being able to use
certainly the membership of Sweden
their capabilities to conduct that.
to NATO. It raises serious questions about a viper at our breast.
Back to India. Is there any early readouts that you can give us of agreements that have come into place,
In NATO. And
whether it's joint
I know the president
relationship with Hungary. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly.
and the Prime Minister just met, so I'm confident there'll be readouts of their engagements here shortly. Certainly, we'll take that question, and if
I now recognize Mr. Heisinger, 5 minutes. Yes, and then you.
we have more to provide from the Pentagon, we'll send that out for you. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
You yield back? Okay. Mr. Schneider, I yield to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to the committee and join the conversation. I want to thank the witnesses and to my friend, Mr. Heisinger, as we have over the past. And President Zelensky's refusal to leave Kiev and to lead his nation has been an inspiration to the world. It's been our privilege to support the brave Ukrainian warfighters who sacrificed and continue to sacrifice each and every day. This war will end when the guns stop. Continue to sacrifice each and every day. This war will end when the guns stop firing. But the peace can only begin once Ukraine has ironclad guarantees of its independence and its security. What I'd like to ask both of you is, can you touch on what is significant and what potential guarantees would help Ukraine, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of providing those guarantees?
I think I'll talk briefly about NATO and then pass it to Deputy Assistant Secretary Cooper. NATO, of course, provides security guarantees only to NATO allies, of which Ukraine is not a member. But what NATO is looking to do is to send, rather through this longer-term package of support at NATO, indication of its commitment to support Ukraine in its struggle in the way that it can, primarily through its non-lethal assistance to complement the bilateral lethal assistance, and to make that commitment not only sort of year to year as it has been done so far in the past, but to talk about a much longer-term commitment to indicate the long-term NATO support for Ukraine.
And then, Congressman, I'll just fill in from the bilateral perspective, which complements this NATO perspective on how to assure Ukraine in the long term. The United States, but also other allies, are considering how we can convey that long-term support. And it's a security issue, so it's an issue for my department when you think about ensuring the viability of the Ukrainian armed forces in the long term. But it's also important to note that this is an economic and recovery and reconstruction issue as well, and that's where you see, allies and partners coming together in London to talk about reconstruction. So we are engaging in these conversations, privately, and we are working on how we might be able to provide this kind of support.
Great, thank you. And expanding the view, or expanding the focus for a second, the other gray zones, independent from Russia but within striking distances, for example, Georgia and Moldova. What should we do in those circumstances?
Congressman, I spend, when I'm not thinking about Ukraine or Russia, I tend to be thinking about Moldova and Georgia a good deal. What we have seen is very different in both countries, but in both cases, we have, during this period of crisis, have redoubled our effort to have strong military-to-military ties and to maintain our support for these countries to be able to defend themselves, recognizing that the threat is quite real. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Ambassador.
I just wanted to add that following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, NATO realized that some of its partners were at risk to Russian malign influence, and that includes Georgia, Moldova, but also Bosnia, Herzegovina, and it has initiated tailored packages for each one to help them resist malign influence. And also, the alliance will be inviting the foreign ministers of these three countries to come to the summit to meet with NATO foreign ministers as a sign of support for them and the special focus on them as at-risk NATO partners.
Great, thank you. My red light's on, so I'm out of time, but I would be negligent if I didn't mention I am the co-chair with my friend Joe Wilson of the Bulgaria caucus, and if we had more time, we would talk about the Balkans as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Huizinga for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. I appreciate your indulgence in giving me a moment. I had a chance this past weekend to be in Stockholm, in Sweden, with the Transatlantic Legislative Dialogue. That, as you can imagine, fascinating time right now with what's been going on. There was members of the EU Parliament from Finland that were there, and a number of other countries. Quite a lot of conversation about Sweden's ascension into NATO. And I just want to publicly, again, state my support of that, and we hope that those that appear to be holding this back, Hungary and Turkey, that they come to their senses on this, and that they see that this would be a positive thing to have for NATO. One of the issues that I discussed at length while we were there with a number of our European colleagues was the Arctic and what was going on. Certainly with Finland and Sweden, or hopefully soon Sweden, now being a part of NATO, they are part of the Arctic Council. Russia is also a part of that Arctic Council. Incredibly, China is trying to claim near Arctic status and seem to have a cooperation with Russia about that. In fact, these are published public facts that Canada earlier this year discovered Chinese listening buoys in Canadian waters up in the Arctic. So I've been seeing that this is not just a strategic area, valuable and ripe with valuable commodities and energy and minerals. It's also has commercial, geopolitical implications, and frankly, security implications. And it's no doubt that China has its eyes and designs on that, and in fact, it even has something called the Polar Silk Road initiative. So it cannot be ignored that area is rising in its importance. So recently, I sent a letter with the support of Chairman Kane and fellow members of this committee to Secretary Blinken, seeking states' plan to bolster our Arctic allies and partners to thwart Russia and Chinese influence in the region. Within the letter, I pointed to Finland's ascension to NATO, in addition to Sweden's pending ascension, as a marker of a fundamental shift in the Arctic. So first and foremost, and I guess this would be to you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Jones, what can NATO do to expand and strengthen our partnership in the Arctic? And is there a common understanding or a path ahead from NATO on further engagement in the Arctic region, or are there some other member nations that might take some more convincing?
So I agree that the Arctic is a area of increased attention. It's growing geostrategic challenges, and it's also rising on NATO's agenda. As you mentioned, when Sweden and Finland join the alliance, then 7 of the 8 Arctic nations will be in NATO.
Yeah.
So that's a lot more of the Arctic in NATO. And NATO also sees rising importance there, primarily as a result of Russia's increased military presence in what it calls the High North, and also China.
Okay, we've got just a little over a minute now. I want to hit on a couple of other quick things. There was a 2022 report titled The National Strategy for the Arctic Region. One of the areas was sustainable development capacity. However, security capacity was not mentioned in that. And I'm trying to push on this. Is the Biden administration support the idea of an escalated involvement in the Arctic region, not just for development reasons and for sustainable development reasons, but for security reasons? You understand my distinction here, right? I mean, the security was not, and military importance and security importance wasn't discussed, but there was a lot of emphasis more on sustainability. And I want to make sure that we're not just focused on sustainability and green initiatives in the Arctic. I want to make sure that we are also seeing the strategic military as well as security elements in the Arctic.
So,
Congressman, you know, aside from that particular document, I can just emphasize that, yes, we recognize the strategic and security dimensions of the Arctic, and we have long recognized the malevolent role that Russia plays in the region, and now are very mindful of watching China's moves. So this is an occupation for the Department of Defense, and it is something that we are focused on.
Okay, and I know, Mr. Chairman, my time is up, and I'd like to follow up with some written questions through the chair to you about an Arctic, unified Arctic NATO command, as well as how NATO can address the challenges from the PRC in that Arctic security, regarding Arctic security in that region. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence and yield back.
Yeah, without objection, we certainly will. With no further questions from members, I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. In closing, I would like to make some brief remarks. Mr. Jones, I appreciate the steps you laid out in reaffirming NATO allies' strong support for Ukraine. However, none of the steps you outlined provide Ukraine a clear path to NATO membership when conditions allow. Only by providing a clear path can we signal to Putin that he cannot achieve his objectives on the battlefield, and he will lose this war. Our allies from Poland to the Baltic states to even now France are pushing for a clearer path. U.S. leadership is required to get this over the finish line, and I fear from what I've heard today that the U.S. may in fact be impeding this critical effort. The U.S. needs to do more than simply put window dressing on the 2008 Bucharest Pledge. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witnesses, and that we will ask you to respond to these promptly in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.